Hi there, we are reading Medicine Walk by Ardith Mayer. Yesterday we read chapter 10, today we will begin chapter 11. In chapter 10, Burr just kept walking. He had a lot of thinking that he was doing along his way, trying to get out of this Arizona desert, and he has been really thinking a lot about his dad and the advice that his dad gave him and Nachito's advice, and he realized that the cougar might very possibly be his totem animal that Nachito had always talked about, and that he was excited maybe at the end of his medicine walk, if and when he got out of there, that his name would somehow have cougar in it, and he was excited maybe about that a little bit. And all these things that he's thinking is just ways to get his mind to not think about that he's hurting and that he doesn't have water and all of those. So he's daydreaming a lot. He had found a pebble, and from what Nachito had told him, put the pebble in your mouth and it'll make your mouth water a little bit. And it did. It wasn't great, but it helped a little bit. And before he went to sleep that night, he decided to draw an arrow in the dirt so he would remember which way that he wanted to go the next day. So here we are going to be on chapter 11, and it's Feelings Don't Amount to Much. The next morning was a blur. I found a pinyon and chewed on needles for my breakfast. I took a tiny sip of water. I shook myself vigorously, trying to make my body feel as if it were alive. Then I dared to look into the bottle to see how much water was left. There might be half a teacup left. I stared down at the arrow that I'd drawn the night before. It pointed off to what seemed empty country. But I had seen those lights. There had to be something there, beyond the heights and the valleys. I checked the angle of the sun, looked around for something tall enough to give me a reference point. I knew I'd have to pick up some new ones as I moved down into lower country, but I picked a point that would give me something to keep my mind and my bearings by for a while, at least. Only then did I take a cautious mouthful from the bottle and settle it comfortably around my tongue. Once I began walking again, the liquid warmed rapidly in my mouth. I moved slowly, looking back at those boulders often, making certain I was headed right. My feet weren't altogether on the rough terrain, and my head was already feeling light again. The land slanted, but the downward slope was less abrupt than others that I had traveled. That helped a little for a while. By noon, I was down in another canyon, treading my way among fallen boulders. A long angle of scree seemed to promise a way out, further along in the direction I wanted to go. I tried to sort things out as I walked. Was it 4 or 5 days? I seemed to have been climbing and walking and trying for years. I counted backward. I could remember 4, no, 5 nights spent curled against rocks or in hollows or in a tree. For the past day and a half, there'd been nothing to eat. I didn't trust my memory about edible insects, and the plants in this area were different from the ones back home. To get sick now was to die, and I knew it. As the sun roasted me, drawing my flesh onto my bones, I found myself wanting to give up. The water had been swallowed for a long time now. I hurt in everything I owned. It would be so nice to say, I can't do anymore. I've given it my best shot, but this is as far as I can go. Then I'd lie in some shady spot and wait for things to end. The tiny slosh left in the bottle wouldn't even make a mouthful to travel on. I was done. Every bone I had screamed for me to stop, to give up, to accept whatever might come. I thought about doing just that as I crawled and slid and scrambled up the loose scree, stones sliding down behind me to the canyon's floor. But I was like a steak on Dad's outdoor grill. This wasn't a good place to die, out here in the sun with nothing but shattered rocks all around. I'd get to the top, then I'd quit. Once there, I uncapped the bottle and drank the rest of the water. Might as well die with a wet throat. Then I looked around. I was on a high roll of land that ridged off into a maze of other ridges and canyons. There were trees nearby. Real trees. Water? I couldn't find a drop. But at least there was shade. Shade to die in. I found a likely spot and lay full length beneath the shelter of the dusty green branches. I closed my eyes. All I had to do was wait. Dad would come for me after a while. Maybe Mom would come too. So you feel tired and hot and thirsty and hungry? That was Nachito's sharp old voice in my ear. That is really tough. How do you think those Apache felt when Geronimo took them from the government camp and ran them across the desert? Over 50 miles it was. Mostly women and children too, and old people. They were gone before the cavalry knew anything was even up. But they were Apache, I protested, opening my eyes. I didn't see Nachito, but the waspish voice didn't stop talking. They were human. They weren't up against a life or death situation. They could have stayed where they were, starving and sick, begging for scraps of rotten meat from the white men. But they saw a vision of freedom, and they went after it. Just freedom, White Eye, not survival. They gambled everything they had. Some of them won. I rolled over onto my stomach and covered my ears with my hands. That didn't help a bit. So, your feelings are all shot, are they? The people know how to turn their feelings. That was why the whites thought us so cruel. We didn't let ourselves feel anything except one thing toward which we aimed. Feelings don't amount to much, Burr Henderson. They're a luxury for people who don't have to scrounge and strain and dig to survive. If you're going to let something silly like feelings make you lie down and die, then I'm through with you. Charlie knows better. I thought you'd been around him and me enough to learn that. I sighed and sat up. My head was clearer than it had been for a long time. I guess I must have been around Charlie and his grandfather long enough to pick up something, I said aloud. I startled a lizard who took flight. They won't let me give up and die. I groaned and stood. The bottle weighed more than it had when it was full. I almost threw it away, but tucked it into the pouch with the flash and the bandages. I might need it later. I might find water. I knew I wouldn't stop again. Nachito wouldn't let me. I looked back across the canyon I'd come through. In the distance, I could see the distinctive pile of rocks. I looked in the direction I was going. Off there was a town. I found an irregular peak I thought might stay in sight for a while, and stared off again. And then I began. My feet were terrible. My head throbbed with heat and dizziness. I felt as if I might stumble and fall and be totally unable to move, no matter how Nachito scolded. Just feelings. What if I were carrying a couple of babies, running for all I was worth to get away from conditions Nachito had told me about in the government camps for Apache? Soldiers pursuing, and they wouldn't mind killing me no matter if I were a woman or a child or a man or baby, young or old. As I went, I turned off feelings, one set at a time. Feet, scratch, feet. My mind blanked out and set of pains. Legs, ditto. Up my body I went, erasing any signals my nerves were sending to my brain. When I finished, I felt like a robot, stalking along on metal pads. I didn't need anything but an occasional grease job and maybe a jolt of electricity every 1,000 miles. The idea struck me as very funny, and I laughed as I walked, my throat cracking. I'm a burbot, I shouted, my face cracked. I'll make it now. And that is the end of chapter 11. Chapter 12 tomorrow. We'll find out what happens.